Hi, morning everyone, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Andy Shepherd. I'm the clinical lead here at ReadyCare, and today we're going to be talking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this one is really interesting. The reason it's so interesting is because the approach to reversing fatty liver is totally counterintuitive. So your first assumption, if you have fatty liver, might be, well, I assume I need to eat less fat if I have a lot of fat in my liver. And actually, that's not at all what bears out in the literature. So let's take a look at a couple of bits and pieces around what fatty liver is, the mechanisms behind fatty liver, how to reverse it, and what sort of food you should be eating more of, which you should be eating less of, and so on. Okay, so first and foremost, fatty liver is the most common liver disease in the Western world. It's the second most common reason for liver transplant after alcoholic fatty liver disease, steatohepatitis from alcoholic fatty liver disease. But I believe that's on a trajectory over the next few years that if it keeps going at the same trajectory that it is, it will become the most common reason for liver transplant. So, and that is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, by the way, is fatty liver disease that can't be explained by overconsumption of alcohol. So it's diagnosed by a couple of different ways. I'll show you those ways now in a second. But again, it's the leading indication for transplant in people under the age of 50 and also the leading risk factor for liver cancer. Okay, so if you look at the prevalence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, what's really interesting is we used to use things like, you'll see these in a standard blood test, ALT and GGT to give us some idea of whether or not we have fatty liver. ALT just stands for alanine transaminase. It's a liver enzyme that will usually go up when you're becoming pre-diabetic, diabetic, getting fatty liver, and so on. And GGT stands for gamma glutamate transferase. Both of those have low predictability in terms of forecasting whether or not you have fatty liver disease. A much better way actually is what they call a CAP, a controlled attenuation parameter. So when you do that, you'll see that in the general population, somewhere between 38 and 42% of people have fatty liver. So it's incredibly prevalent. In the diabetic population, I heard a scientist recently saying that about 90% of type 2 diabetics have fatty liver and the other 10% haven't found out yet. So basically just saying if you have type 2 diabetes or even pre-diabetes, you have a fatty liver. You may not have seen it yet, but you do have a fatty liver. So this is a kind of a scary one, actually. This is from a research paper in Germany a couple of years back that showed that 40% of adults have fatty liver. If you're overweight or obese, one or the other, there's a 60% chance that you have fatty liver. And if you're diabetic, you probably have a fatty liver. You're talking 90% plus. But in overweight children, 30% of them have a fatty liver. And this will make sense when we go through the mechanisms as to what actually causes a fatty liver. So it's not dietary fat. So why is fatty liver important? Well, all of the things that we fear the most, from cancers, mainly hormone positive cancers, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, weight gain around the midsection, they all start with the liver. So there's a really good expression from, or a saying, I should say, that's attributed to Professor Roy Taylor, who's one of the leading guys in kind of type 2 diabetes and fatty liver in the UK. And Roy Taylor would have said that before the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, there's a long silent scream from the liver. So basically, the liver is under pressure. You won't feel anything, nothing at all. You won't feel it, but you'll start to see in different metrics your liver starting to go in the wrong direction. One of the things you can see is ALT and GGT going a little bit out of range or being on the high side. The next thing you'll see is dyslipidemia, which is your HDL level will go below 1.4, 1.5. Your triglycerides will go a bit high. These are all signs of a diabetic physiology. Now, if you find one way you can know if you're at a really high risk of fatty liver, or even if you have fatty liver and it's undiagnosed, and by the way, that's nothing to panic about because I'm going to teach you how to reverse it now. If you do want to check if you have it, a really good way of knowing is, first of all, you can get an ultrasound done, but there's probably a much easier way of doing it. And that is, look at your HDL number in your cholesterol profile. If that's below 1.3, 1.35, the likelihood is you're at a really high risk or you have a fatty liver, especially if that's combined with a triglyceride above 1.7, 1.8, those kind of numbers. But a really easy visual way to tell is if you store fat around the midsection almost predominantly, so where you store the vast majority of your fat is around your midsection. So you don't really put it on your face and your bum and your shoulders. Most of it goes around your midsection, around your tummy, that kind of spare tire. That's a sure sign that you have what's known as visceral fat storage. So visceral fat storage just means fat storage around the midsection. So if you store your fat around that kind of spare tire belly area, if you ever see a guy and he's outwardly relatively thin, he turns around, he's got that kind of basketball look, that is 100% fatty liver disease, and it's undiagnosed pre and or type 2 diabetes as well. So that's how you know. That type of fat is known as visceral fat, and visceral fat just refers to fat that's stored in and around internal organs. So the other type of fat is known as sub-Q or subcutaneous fat. So if you hold fat in your face and shoulders and bum and a little bit on your tummy, you're at less of a risk. Even if you're 14, 15, 16 stone upwards, you're at less of a risk compared to somebody who stores most of their fat around the midsection. So that's the visceral fat. So what happens is, as you start to become insulin resistant, so that kind of diabetic physiology we often speak about, so your pancreas is starting to become tired from making too much insulin, from eating a lot of carbohydrate and sugar, and or being particularly sensitive to it from a genetic predisposition or proclivity point of view. What happens is your body starts to struggle with carbohydrate, and this is the key. It inappropriately stores those triglycerides. So those carbohydrates break down to glucose. Glucose, if the body can't deal with them appropriately by producing insulin and pushing the energy out to the cells, it stores glucose as fat inside an internal organs. And this is a real light bulb moment. It's not dietary fat that causes fatty liver at all. In fact, completely the opposite. It's dietary carbohydrate when you become insulin resistant. So as you start to become insulin resistant, and an easy way of saying that is your pancreas is starting to get tired, that kind of diabetic type physiology. What happens is your body inappropriately, it stops responding to the glucose coming in, and it says, I can't deal with all this glucose because I can't be bothered to make insulin. That's the pancreas going on holidays. We call that pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, when it gives up working altogether for a while. Your body starts to inappropriately deal with the glucose by converting it into what are known as triglycerides and shoving it into internal organs. So we see this is known as ectopic fat storage. We see this in the liver. We call that fatty liver. We see it in the tongue, and we call that sleep apnea in the back palate of the tongue. We see it in the pancreas. We call it fatty pancreas. In the heart, we call it myocardial ectopic fat storage. So these are all different manifestations of the same root cause, which is carbohydrate metabolism dysfunction. Nothing to do with dietary fat, funnily enough. Okay, back to this guy for a second. So the reason we should be worried about it is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, meaning that if you don't have high blood pressure, if you don't have type 2 diabetes, it still puts you at a really high risk of cardiovascular disease. And the main reason for that is it lies at the center of cardiovascular disease. It's the beginnings of type 2 diabetes. It's the beginnings of high blood pressure, that weight gain around the midsection, the dyslipidemia, so the HDL going down, the triglycerides going up, and so on. So it's a warning sign. It's, as Professor Roy Taylor so eloquently put it, it's that long silent scream from the liver before all the other stuff starts to go askew. Now, if we were to look at the dietary drivers of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, so the problem is a fat buildup in the liver and the dysfunction that follows and the risk that puts the rest of our body at. You might look at, I know I would have anyway, before getting into the research around metabolic health, I would have looked at animal fats and thought, well, surely eggs and butter and cream and fatty meats contain more fat. Therefore, we should probably eat less of those. That would be the assumption. But that's not the case at all, actually. So complex carbs like rice, bread, pasta, potatoes, we'd say, well, there's no fat in those, so we probably shouldn't worry about those as a suspect. And we certainly shouldn't worry about fruit because there's little or no fat in fruit. Most fruits, with the exception of maybe avocados. We would say they're not going to be a suspect at all until we look at the literature. So the fattening of the fat cells inside in the liver, and it's a process known as, and we'll just get a little bit sciencey for a couple of minutes, it's known as de novo lipogenesis, which is, I think, is Latin for new fat storage. Lipo meaning fat, genesis meaning to create, and de novo meaning new. So the new fat storage, or the de novo lipogenesis, is caused by 15% of it is caused by dietary fat. So we shouldn't be all that concerned about dietary fat. 26% of it is caused by carbs and fructose, so bread, rice, pasta, and fruit sugar. And the other 59% is caused by high levels of insulin, again, carbohydrate. So actually, if we go back and look at the factors that feed into a fatty liver, fat is the least thing we should be worried about. We should be worried about eating too much rice, bread, pasta, especially if we have that, insulin resistant physiology. So if you have a mum or a dad who had heart disease, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, any of those diet related illnesses, we should be worried about it. If you're someone who gains weight easily and you're sensitive to carbohydrates, that's something you should be worried about. And if you already know you have or have had a fatty liver, we should actually be looking to reduce carbohydrates and fruit. So sugar and refined sugars, not fat. So again, the foods that cause our blood sugar levels to spike the highest, the ones that cause weight gain, high blood pressure, these are all at the root cause of a fatty liver. And it's been a surprise to a lot of our patients and even to a couple of hepatologists over the years with patients of ours that we put a patient on a high fat diet. So again, this is totally counterintuitive. We put patients on a high fat diet and we see dramatic turnarounds in their liver health. And when I say dramatic, I might show you a case study at the end here. I mean dramatic. I mean, we had a patient in a trial in the UK, in our Homewell trial, which won the Clinical Pharmacy Congress overall winners in excellence in general practice award. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I have to try and remember it. Where we showed one patient who had a fatty liver. Sorry, I'll correct myself. He actually had something worse than a fatty liver. When a fatty liver goes on and becomes worse again, it becomes something known as NASH, which is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, meaning that you've basically got cirrhosis of the liver. The liver is scarred and really damaged almost beyond repair. So he had that. His liver enzymes went back to normal and basically went from bordering on that. We saw a couple of patients like this, bordering on liver transplant kind of territory to perfectly normal liver health. So it just goes to show the difference in the correct dietary approach as opposed to just kind of medicating the symptoms, we'll say. So the foods that you want to eat more of, funnily enough, are fat and protein, not refined carbohydrates. So going on a low-fat diet and eating whole grains and cereals and porridge is arguably the worst thing you could do for a fatty liver. That and drinking alcohol and eating too much fruit. So, which is a nice segue onto the next slide, completely accidental, I have to say. If we look at fruit, you might think, well, fruit is healthy, and don't get me wrong, it is healthier than processed food, but fruit is healthy, therefore I should eat lots of fruit if I have a fatty liver. You should eat no fruit, little or no fruit, maybe strawberries, raspberries, blackberries if you have fatty liver. The reason for that is fruit sugar, not only is it not healthy and natural and all that kind of nonsense you'd hear from people who are less versed in metabolic health, but fruit sugar is not even arguably, it is definitely worse than normal sugar for your liver. And the reason for that is it lies in, if we look at the metabolic pathways, when you eat carbohydrate or if you eat pure sugar and you say, for example, your bottle of Lucozade there, just as an example, has a lot of glucose in it. That is really, really bad for you, don't get me wrong. But the glucose causes stimulation of insulin, and some of the glucose will go into the muscle in the form of glycogen. Some of it will be sent out to the cells for energy, and some of it will end up in the liver. That's glucose. All of the fructose goes straight to the liver. It bypasses that usual metabolic pathway that glucose follows. It goes straight to the liver and causes an awful lot of de novo lipogenesis, which is fat storage in the liver, that term I was talking about earlier on. So if you wanted to give someone a fatty liver, the foods that you would feed to them, not that you would, and we see this in animals where we have what's it called, foie gras, and if you want to fatten up a liver in duck liver and things like that, they tend to give them ripened fruit or loads of grains, one or the other. They force feed them grains, and if they don't have grains or if they won't eat the grains, organic foie gras, if you look up how is organic foie gras made, they actually feed the ducks overly ripened fruit because there's more fructose in overly ripened fruit. So a darker color banana is way higher in fructose than a ripe one. Neither of them are good for you. But so the same thing applies in human physiology. Fructose is directly stored in the liver as triglycerides. So you get a fatty liver from overconsumption of fruit, especially if you're already on that kind of insulin resistant pathway. And this one kind of puts a nail in the coffin in terms of which approach is superior. Should we go low fat, low calorie, or should we go low carb? On isocaloric interventions, and by isocaloric interventions, I mean in both of these groups, in the low fat group and the low carb group. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. What year was this? From 2011, actually. So it was a great study that showed if you put people on a calorically controlled intervention, so let's say, for example, the number was 100 patients or a cohort of 100, you split that into two cohorts. One goes low fat and one goes low carb diets, but they're both on roughly the same amount of calories. The weight loss is around 5%. The weight loss in kilograms, is around 5 kgs. So they lost about 12 pounds or so, around a stone, in, I think it was 10 or 12 weeks. But the reduction in liver fat on the low fat group was 28%. And on the low carb group was 55%. It was over double. No, I'm not good at maths. It wasn't over double. It was just under double. It was around double. So again, there can be no question. Low carb is superior to low fat for non-alcoholic liver disease, and by a long shot, actually. Okay, that is about it. Just a quick one. Thought you'd be interested in that. So again, low carb diets are not just good for reversing diabetes. They just happen to reverse diabetes as well. They're really, really good for weight loss. There's potential mechanisms at play there that would say that they would prevent or minimize your chance of getting cancer, and even, and I'll cover this over the next few months, but even potentially slow down cancer progression and stop some cancers as well. Potentially. I'm not claiming that ketogenic diets can cure cancer at all, but there are mechanisms at play that show, and research ongoing at the moment, that showed the slowing of tumor growth and even stopping in some instances when patients are put on low carb diets as an adjunct to chemotherapy, not as a separate intervention. That's not what I'm saying at all. We know they're great for polycystic ovarian syndrome, neurological disorders, and I'm going to cover that in the next few weeks, actually. It's an incredible study just came out on neurological disorders. They're great for weight, cognitive performance, sleep, feeling better, all that sort of stuff. And that's how they reverse non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I'll keep it short today, guys. Thanks for taking the time out to watch this. I really appreciate you being here. If you haven't already done so, please click and I always get the wrong one. Please click the subscribe button over here, I think. And there's a bell notification on the other side. And we'll see you soon. Thanks again, everyone. See you next week. Bye-bye.